Yeah, it needs to be plain language also,
Yeah.
Want to get the link?
Yeah. We can't.
Hi.
It's on the
Oh, you're
screen.
here.
Can we do it on the screen? Okay.
I'm 50 years late. I'm the person you met as part on that. But you're the only person here that I recognize from all the meetings I've been to. And that was profound and really I couldn't thank you more. Thank you so much.
Since I've been around in AA since the 70s, I think this is the best time to find recovery. And I'm talking recovery broader than AA. Like, I think my meeting's the best meeting in the world, but we're going to be talking about a lot of different ways people find their recovery. Like I said, it's pretty good. Isn't it great to be together again? Hi, John. Like, I miss you so much. It's good to see you. I've just been infected by how people are noticing how tall people are, things they didn't understand on Zoom. Troy came up and said, it's nice to meet you. I said, aren't you Troy? Like, haven't we been together like 3 times a week for 4 years? But I know what he means when he says it's nice to meet you, because they haven't quite found the hug emoticon that really does the same thing as in-person life does. So I'm going to be talking about a few things, just because I wrote them down when they sent, what are you going to talk about? And so I had to make slides that match them. And one is a little bit about what's happened in the last 18 years or so with the science of recovery. And I'm not a scientist, I'm a journalist. My day job, Rebellion Dogs Publishing, I've been involved in writing all kinds of things. And one of them is addiction recovery and mental health, and music, and believe it or not, finance, and anywhere there's people like us, I've been writing about it. So everything I'm going to talk about is as a journalist, someone collecting information, and I don't stand for the information. I won't defend the information. I just want to present what is out there and being sort of critically reviewed right now. And we can go online with discussing the facts or the techniques or the biases or the legitimacy of it. That's all fun to do, but that's just a backdrop to what I want to talk about is something called CHIME, which is connection, hope, identity, meaning, and empowerment. These are the characteristics that people who thrive in recovery demonstrate. People who have post-traumatic gains, people who are better off now than they were before their infliction, mental health, or substance use issues, before that happened. They are better off from suffering through depression or from having trauma or from, not because of it, but because of their recovery process. They're in a better place now than they've ever been. They're not a diminished shadow of themselves. They are better. And so people started studying, well, let's look at what those people have in common, and maybe we can gear our programming to encouraging those things. And they are connection, hope, identity, meaning, and empowerment. I feel like I haven't given it all away because when you get into the weeds, it's really cool. So up here I said, One Bigger Tent. A very important book for people in our situation. Anybody who is in any sort of marginalized population or special interest group, hearing recovery spoken in your own native tongue is so important. Whether it's LGBTQIA, whether it's women to women, whether it's agnostics and atheists talking to each other, whether it's someone from the BIPOC community, Black, Indigenous, people of color, right? Hearing other people with the same cultural experiences talking about your recovery is absolutely essential and necessary, I think, for connection. So when I'm talking about one bigger tent, I'm talking about more than AA. According to SAMHSA, which is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, there are 29 million people in this is the US only, who identify as having had a substance abuse problem, and 72.2% of them, 21 million people, consider themselves to be in recovery. What's the percentage? What did you think the percentage of people who find recovery was?
10%.
Yeah, exactly. And I'll tell you why you think that, because it has to do with the lack of evidence that we had and the bad science that sort of came with it. And let's look at the 29 million people in America who call themselves in recovery. And we can argue about what recovery means. Does California sober count? Right? Does harm reduction count? Like we all have a different definition, but these are people who self-identify as in recovery. So whatever that means to them, and probably what it means to their family, is things are way better now than they were at some time in the past. So all of these things are great things. We can separate the pepper from the fly shit and spend the whole day talking about them. But I just want to give you a sort of a global overview. Of these 29 million Americans, how many of them are AA members? Who knows approximately, according to AA's only unsophisticated means of collecting data, how many AA members are there in the United States of America?
2 million.
Less than 2 million.
Well, okay, 2 million globally,
Worldwide.
and 1.4 million in the US alone. So AA is definitely growing in the United States of America still. That's more than it was in the year 2000. But in other jurisdictions, Canada, and can everybody see? I can get the heck out of the way. Just, again, like Alan said, tell me what you need, and I'll blame you for it. Okay. So in places like Canada, we have 17% less AA members than we did in the year 2000. And that isn't because alcoholism has gone away in Canada. We haven't cured that. Outside of Canada, US, we're closer to 25% smaller population in AA from the year 2000 to the year 2022, the last time they did this report in box 459. And these are unsophisticated methods of collecting data, but I think what's useful is 1.4 million isn't a true number. It's either more than that or it's less than that. But having it as a comparison to the same unsophisticated method they used to collect the data in the year 2000, I think that's helpful or useful as long as we don't get too religious about, or rigid about the data. But so in some places AA is growing, in some places it's not. There are only 1.4 million of those 29 million people are in recovery. So when I think of a bigger tent, I'm thinking of all of the people getting sober many different ways. Some of them are going to the gym, some of them are going to Smart Recovery or LifeRing or Dharma Recovery. There's a lot of different ways to get sober now. So let's go back to where we got the idea that only 5 or 10% of people ever got sober. And in the year 2006, the findings were that there were no scientific evidence that AA was effective. And this was from an extensive review that was done in the Cochrane Library database in 2006. And they found there was a limited high-quality research available, and the gold standard is something that they call randomized controlled trials. And it wasn't that there was proof that AA didn't work. That's not what they were saying. But they just had no scientific evidence based on their own criteria of what they consider, non-anecdotal evidence, like I'm sober, that's 100%, there you go, you know? So beyond, because we all have anecdotal evidence, but by their own scientific criteria, there wasn't a body of evidence to really suggest AA worked. And other people said, well, see, it doesn't work, right? Lance Dotis, The Sober Truth, the bad science behind AA. You know, we just saw the most recent is that 7 out of 10 people find recovery. You can expect to find recovery, not right away necessarily, but people who are looking for recovery will find recovery. But back then, there was some idea that, you know, you would be as likely to get sober just staying home and watching reruns as you were going to a treatment center or going to AA or whatever else was out there at the time. And that lack of evidence spurred a need for more research, and through the Obama years, and there was a number of initiatives that more and more evidence was collected, and people who study alcoholics, non-alcoholics who love the unlovable, have found out a lot more about us, and we're going to take a look at that. This is just one study. John Kelly, his name's going to come up more and more, and they found that of the people they studied, 54% reported assisted pathways. So half of that 21 million didn't do it alone. And David Best, who we'll talk about, will say nobody gets sober alone, because you don't have to join a fellowship to get sober, but you need a community to help you. Helpful home environment. Some of us have toxic home environments, so we need our meetings. Some people have helpful home environments, and that'll work. A helpful workplace. There is something called the recovery-ready work environment, where it's going to support your sobriety. And if taking clients out and getting them drunk is part of your job, recovery is going to be a little bit more difficult for you. You can have a supportive environment without actually joining a club, and 54% did. 28% went to treatment. So some of us remember where only 1 out of 10 went to treatment, and the rest of them just went through the DTs in the meetings, right? You know, it's funny what I hear is disturbing an AA meeting these days. Oh, really? You know, you should have just been there to see what it smelled like, you know, and sounded like, you know, back in the 70s when people were detoxing. So by 2020, a lot more research was done, and again, I'm just reporting what the data was telling us, a high certainty of evidence that clinically delivered manualized TSF, and that stands for 12-step facilitation. So this is, you know, the Minnesota model done with a little bit more sophistication. So if any of you went to a treatment center that said, before you leave treatment, you got to go to a meeting, we'd like you to get a sponsor and make an appointment with that sponsor before you leave the treatment center to start working the steps, that's 12-step facilitation. Or what did you think of that meeting? Was it a bunch of crackpots, or did you relate? Okay, maybe we'll find you another meeting, right? You know, it's, you know, they're not all the same. So this 12-step facilitation, which is designed to increase AA participation to higher rates, this was a more successful means of finding recovery than other things it was measured against, which largely the most popular were CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, and motivational enhancement therapy, and many of us use that now or have used that, and it's very effective, but it's a lot more expensive, where you know, you can go to AA for free and there's no waiting list. And so the key findings, that AA was better at abstinence, and it also found that it was also better at improving the quality of life, where we would say, well, this poor sucker, he keeps relapsing. But what they observed is the occurrences of relapse were less frequent, and the severity of those relapses was less than it was pre-intervention of going to meetings. So they take the walk of shame to go get another newcomer chip. And the clinicians who are studying us said, there's a success story, right? He didn't lose his job this time, right? He didn't beat his wife this time. He didn't kill anybody in his car drunk this time, right? This intervention has improved the quality of this person's life. And they kind of noticed AA was a little bit more cost effective than some other therapeutic meetings. They also designed more ways of looking at what our recovery looks like. The initiation stage, from pre-contemplation to action, commitment, admitting we have a problem, detoxifying, early abstinence in the first 90 days, completion of detox, improvements, beginning to emotionally thaw. We're talking about emotional sobriety. First, we have to find them. Emotionally thawing for me, sobriety didn't solve my problems. It exposed them. And I needed something other than going back to what had stopped working to do, right? Like it was like I had a bad plan, and I couldn't imagine any better plan because sobriety sounded like a punishment for being an alcoholic as far as I was concerned. And then 90 days to 5 years, they call that maintenance time. And long-term recovery, they start mentoring, they start volunteering, family involvement, leadership, spiritual growth, whatever that means to you. So they have definitions for these things. I don't know who did the math on this, but if you have achieved 5 years of sobriety, you've got a 17% chance of relapse. I mean, that's not perfect, that's not a free pass, but that's not bad. And I would bet that there are things that we can each do to improve that number closer to zero, right? Be actively involved, stay honest, helping others, many of the things we've done. And these CHIME things are going to come into it. So we also found things like the tasks of recovery, right? To refusal skills, like learning to say no, emotional self-regulation, which we were just hearing about, lifestyle health behaviors, setting boundaries, time management, meditation, mindfulness, maturation, catch up. Intellectually retarded, assuming responsibility. So these are interesting ideas. This is a side topic of something that some groups around the nations are looking at, and that's asking, who here has read Living Sober? Or if you're from NA, Living Clean, right? So Living Sober will be 50 years old in 2025. Let's hear it for Living Sober. A rational approach to AA sobriety. And I would argue, well, you can give them that big book. That was a good book, man. There are dozens of cases and 3 or 4 years of valuable experience. But over here in Living Sober, 1975, we've got hundreds of thousands of cases and 40 years of collective experience. Which one would I want a counselor to give to my child if they needed help, right? And again, I'm not saying one is better than the other, but only 7 million copies of Living Sober have circulated, and that dwarfs in comparison to the 40 million plus big books. But most publishing houses would consider 7 million copies a runaway success. So Living Sober is not watered down AA, but it is a little long in the tooth, and it does sound a little 1970s. It talks about finding AA in the phone book. Who was born in this century and is a teenager or in their 20s in their first AA meeting knows what a phone book is, let alone where to find one to find AA, right? So I mean, all 31 chapters of Living Sober are as relevant today as they were then. but maybe they could update a few pronouns, maybe they could update a few ways of finding a meeting, like going online, like including our Zoom experience. It could be brought into a 21st century vernacular and be more effective than it is right now. And these are some of the things we've learned since then. Maybe we could add a few more chapters about neurodivergence, about trauma and recovery, about special purpose and special composition groups, and how important it is to find a group of people that really speak your language. AA isn't McDonald's. It's not the same eating experience, the same menu, the same look and feel every AA meeting you go to. If you've got to shop around to find the one that works for you. We are looking at, let's ask the literature trustees to just sort of look at this and say, go through it with a fine-tooth comb. How could we alter or improve it? And what new ideas could we find? All they need to do is go to the podcast for the Grapevine and see what they're talking about there. I'm sure they would easily find 15 or 20 more topics that we're talking about in meetings, we're talking about in parking lots, we're talking about with our friends in AA that weren't in the 1975 book. So that's just an aside. Bring it up at your district. I think it would be a great idea, because that was my book for AA. That was, if someone quoted an AA phrase, when I first came around, they were quoting Living Sober. And so since 2006 and 2020, a lot of people did life and sobriety surveys. And a lot of people will say, well, surveys, you ask people, they got bias, they're going to tell you what you want to hear, blah, blah, blah. No, maybe that's true. Or maybe asking the actual people with the lived experience will tell you what the lived experience is. I don't know, actually, what the answer to that is, but we have done these. I've written about them at Rebellion Dogs Publishing in Australia, in the UK, in the USA, in Canada. We've done these life in recovery experiences, and they just ask people, what were the therapeutic activities you used? How important was it? And in Canada, 92% of the people they surveyed were going to or had been to 12-step programs, and 80% of them said it was useful. 80%. 20% needed to keep looking. Wasn't working for them. But none of them did one thing. That's the other thing they found. The average number of interventions that they were, sometimes it was a nudge from the judge. It wasn't voluntary. And there is an argument for non-voluntary intervention. Remember that show, Intervention? When the family got around and did all that sort of stuff, that was some crazy shit. Dual diagnosis programs, very necessary for some people, right? AA alone wouldn't work. Aversion therapy in some cases, but the point was multiple approaches were taken. So it's very difficult to say exactly, well, what was the cause of that person's sobriety? Well, we didn't do, a double-blind trial, like they didn't know what therapy they were taking, and neither did the person who was observing them. We just asked people what their experience was, and these were the sorts of things that they were telling us. Even diet, 70% of people said that really mattered to them, like treating themselves better, self-care, religion or spirituality, 88%. So 12%, that's not helpful, right? So none of these were for everybody. Yoga, getting more involved in cultural values. So these surveys were taken and they asked us, and we told them. Other studies that I think are really important, Sarah Zemore, they did a study comparing AA to newer peer-to-peer interventions, Smart Recovery, Life Ring, Women for Sobriety. I asked, well, why didn't you do refuge recovery or recovery dharma? Well, we didn't have the money to do all of that, right? You know, like who's funding this? It's not big pharma, right? You know, so all of these interventions that they study to compare to AA to find, well, what's better, what's the best, they're all newer. They all could just sort of take what AA did right and throw out the rest and improve new things. They found measurably no difference whether someone went to Smart Recovery or Women for Sobriety or I'm Sure She Recovers or Dharma Recovery or AA or NA or whether it was secular AA or a big book study group. They all had the same outcome rates. It didn't really matter what they did. But the important thing was that they found a community of their peers. Now, the 2020 membership survey, I interviewed the people who did this survey. This is the 2020 membership survey in the UK. So the UK brought us the God word, atheists and alcoholics in AA. Isn't that great? Let's thank them. Woo! In Canada, USA, from 1975 to 2012, 11 times we asked the General Service Conference, hey, you know, it's not going to be a bestseller, but we could really use a pamphlet that is atheists and agnostics. Not people who think they might be atheists or agnostics, but atheists and agnostics, how they get sober. I think, you know, for some people in some meetings, hearing that story told in a language that they could relate to, and it never got past the finish line. It often would get support in a number of different places. In the UK, the first time they asked, they went, oh, we don't have one of those? Sure, let's do it. Let's gather some stories, and boom, boom, boom. And then eventually a bunch of our groups said, we need this here in Canada, USA, sea change. I think it's been a contributing factor to the ebb and flow of fundamentalism in AA. It's now available in English, French, and Spanish, so that's a great thing about bringing it over here. So they have a more practical approach to things. Oh, you need that? We'll get it for you, and they got it for us. And in interviewing their members, they're not really fussy about things. They just, what do you need to know? Okay, let's just ask them, right? As opposed to, ooh, I don't know. Some people might be upset if we start asking about that. Maybe it's an outside issue. You know, it's easier to just do things the way we've always done them, you know. The person who designed this survey, as I found out, was a non-alcoholic trustee, a clinical therapist who was an immigrant to England, he saw AA as kind of Christian. That wasn't his cultural background. He didn't know what the religious background of his clients was because he never asked. He was a little concerned about referring people to Alcoholics Anonymous. And then he went to an AA meeting and he cried. They're doing here what I can't do in my groups and we can't do in our centers. They are helping people in ways way beyond what we can do. So eventually he ended up being a Class A non-alcoholic trustee. And he remembered his preconceived ideas about AA and what it was and the sort of things people just like him would want to know. So he thought, well, let's just find out how religious AA is. How many of you believe in a higher power? And it was about 92%. Again, 8% do not at all, but 92% did. Okay, so those of you who do, is your view of higher power religious or secular? And these are words that they chose because that's their language, the language of non-alcoholic professionals that deal with us. And we answer back to them, or the people in the UK and English-speaking Europe, 2/3 of people have a secular view of what higher power is. I don't know exactly what that means. That's just what they said. It might mean fellowship. is their idea of higher power. It might mean the program is their idea of higher power. It might mean the great outdoors or a group of drunks. I don't know, but it's not a prayer answering, sobriety granting type of supernatural force. But a third do, right? And they're all still sober. They're all still helping other alcoholics. But we actually know that now, and we didn't know that way back when. Let's see, why was this so important to me? Okay, yeah, so factors such as social support, treatment access, and resilience play key roles in recovery success. And this is going to sort of feed into my CHIME thing. These are two people that I've already talked about already. David Best, he's from the UK, and John Kelly, who's from Harvard Medical School. He teaches psychiatry there and was the key author in the 2020 Cochrane database review, along with Keith Humphreys from Stanford University. And these two guys were just talking about their next project or whatever at the Recovery Capital Conference in 2022. So both of these guys are non-alcoholics, and both of these guys are, you know, making our life a whole lot better. Mary Leamy, this is the person who came up with this CHIME idea. I didn't invent it. And why? There was no systematic review and narrative synthesis on personal recovery in mental illness. It hadn't been undertaken, so she decided to do it. The aims was to come up with something that, just as I said, the people who are thriving, what are they doing and how does it work? And she came up with this CHIME idea. You can see here that David Best sort of adopted that for people with substance use disorder. And a transition from a deficit to a strength-based model, such as positive psychology. And again, they're dealing with what's working. Let's just focus on what's working, and that's where CHIME came from. So, a connection. Is there anyone here who hasn't seen the TED Talk with Johan Hari, where he ends his talk when he was promoting the Scream? The opposite of addiction isn't sobriety. The opposite of addiction is connection. Who hasn't seen that? Anybody? Okay, those are the people who have or haven't? Okay, so good. We're a mixed crowd. And I agree with what he said, but it's kind of bumper sticker simplistic. It's a little reductionist, because that's a big part of it. Connection is hugely important, but he was talking about the Rat Park study. David Best, entering recovery, knowing just one other person in recovery, you have a 27% better chance of achieving long-term recovery. One person, knowing one person in recovery, you're better off. If you go back to a home where it's a toxic environment where there's drinking, or a work environment where it's a toxic environment with lots of drinking, if you know even if you have to deal with that, you know one person in recovery, you've got a better chance of getting sober. So imagine if you know a whole group or a whole conference. The power of example of others who transform from antisocial to pro-social behavior. So I knew antisocial behavior. It's very isolating, and that's what Johan Hari got right? I came to AA lying to myself, lying to you. Nobody knew who I was, because my core belief was, when you get to know me, you will reject me. Now, there was no evidence to support that, but you can't fight core belief with data. You know, it requires something else. So connection, hope. The thing about hope is we don't manufacture our own hope. Hope is contagious. I didn't come to AA with hope. I was hopeless. I caught it from other people who had recovery. they would say things like, Joe, if it can work for me, it can work for you. They had hope for me. And I didn't have hope for myself. And I heard it over and over, and I started believing it. And then I remember I was 1 foot in, 1 foot out, planning on my escape from Alcoholics Anonymous, right? You know, not quite sure how I was going to do that. But then I heard myself saying to a newcomer, if I can do it, you can do it. What am I saying? Is this true? It was amazing to me that I was infected. Once you are infected, it's like COVID, right? Once you get it, you're infectious. You can give it to other people. So I got hope, and I was able to give it to others. So, and hope isn't proof. Hope is just hope, right? Scientists define hope as having 2 parts, agency and pathways, right? If we can do it, you can do it. We're not going to take your suffering away, Joe, but you're not going to have to go through it alone, right? Very empowering, seeing other people going to their jobs and dealing with troubles without drinking, going to their homes and dealing with troubles without drinking, you know, or school or wherever it was. The word hope is in David Best's book, Pathways to Recovery and Desistance. And I showed you a picture of not the first conference I ever met him at, but it's a great read. I'm not going to go into it. You can all have the slide deck and get it later. Let's go to identity. A person's most salient identity shifts from being defined by membership of a group whose norms and values revolve around substance abuse to being defined by membership for a group whose norms and values encourage recovery. This emerging sense of self is shared with others in recovery, thus strengthening the individual sense of belongingness within recovery-oriented groups. And again, isn't that we can do together what we couldn't do alone, right? There it is right there. This is what the scientists are saying. The first time you ever heard yourself say, my name's Joe and I'm an alcoholic, I thought, what am I doing, trying to fit in? Like I wasn't quite sure if I'd come to that conclusion or not, but when they said, hi Joe, I felt belonging. I felt welcomed into a community. I felt that I wasn't alone. I had an identity that I could maybe play with, because I had an identity as a badass, and it was going to kill me, but you know, having an identity as a teetotaler, you know, that what's behind door number 2? Sex, drugs, and rock and roll. How can you have one without the other? Like, you know, this is, you're talking sobriety as a solution to, you know, my problems. It didn't look good. Meaning. So, some people regain their meaning in life when they come into the rooms. And then they leave. And they go back to what a life that is meaningful. Other people stay in recovery because all of their bridges were burnt, and they find a lot of meaning in their recovery, right? Carrying the message to the still suffering, getting active in service, so on and so forth. There's a lot of ways people find meaning. Yes, William, you get the credit for this. He brought, this fits in with your CHIME thing. I've done this sort of presentation many times, and I keep adding slides from the things people bring me. Ikigai, if I pronounce it right, is a Japanese term for meaning, and they break it down into 4 different things. What you love, what you're good at, what you can get paid for, and what the world needs. Imagine if you could get all 4 of those fulfilled 8 hours a day. Wouldn't that be cool? You know, it's why we see some people, I've seen it in Toronto, give up high-paying jobs and become a drug and alcohol counselor because of the meaning that brought to their life. Their sobriety was so valuable to them, they took a lower-paying job to actually satisfy a greater need, and probably that unmet need probably contributed to their addiction. But I mean, sometimes we have to go have just different pools where I do what I get paid for, but I hate it. But it pays me, right? And I can do the things I love. People have to work it out their own way. And if you get two of them, it's a little better than just one of them. For instance, if you have what the world needs and what you love, you have a mission, but you might not be getting paid for it. So empowerment, and this is the word that, you know, people who love their AA program or their NA program or any sort of their 12-step program, they go, whoa, I don't know if I can be flirting with this empowerment stuff. And I said, we're powerless, right? Where does it say in the literature that we remain powerless? I'm always going to be a person with addiction, right? I mean, if I want to test that, just when no one's looking, see what happens with me and pecan pie. Like, I eat one wedge, and then all I can think about is the other 4 wedges still there, so I eat another one. And when I get to 4 wedges, I just eat the 5th one so I can stop thinking about it, and I'm sick to death, right? You know, this is Joe C., sober since disco, you know, who, you know, is still a perfect example, sample of sobriety, but not necessarily a good example. But empowerment is so much more. And we do find empowerment, whether it's under the 12-step model, or whether it's positive affirmations, or whether it's the SMART recovery toolkit, or any of the other ways people are finding recovery. But in empowerment, we find bridging capital and bonding capital, deepening meaningful relationships, and where we start to connect with our goals. When counselors are interviewing us, don't know about this recovery thing, sometimes they'll say, well, what's important to you? Oh, my kids. What else? Oh, music. What else? And then they start going, oh, this and this and this. Okay, how come you didn't mention doing cocaine? So, you know, do things that are in line with your goals, and, you know, you won't even think about cocaine because you didn't when I asked you what's important to you. And so empowerment happens in all of these different modes of recovery. Now, I want to just talk about something, because when I started talking about this, it seemed like I was talking about something other than the 12 steps, other than AA. And I see this when you start looking through this lens of connection, hope, identity, meaning, empowerment, you'll start seeing it everywhere. And I was doing a presentation in May, and I grabbed the May grapevine, stealing from the book of the Emotional Sobriety podcast, and I thought, well, what have we got here? And here was a story. So this is just, I don't know what meeting this guy goes to, but he says, a newcomer recently asked me what AA taught me. I thought, how on earth can I possibly summarize my time in the fellowship? So he wasn't talking about a program, wasn't talking about 12 steps, he was talking about, you know, connection. It taught me how to be a decent person, live a life inconceivably better than the one I had been living. Meaning, it taught me how to form connection with an amazing community of recovering alcoholics and a higher power of my own understanding. So there's connection, there's identity. I learned that AA is a we program. We learn from each other, and we are here for each other, identity, empowerment. And through the rest of this thing, you keep finding the word hope and meaning and identity all in AA speak. And here's some whiz questions for you, right? Was there a time in your life between addiction and recovery that you recall feeling connected instead of isolated? And if you did, like, think about that. Like when did that happen? And what kind of difference did it make to you? For me, secular AA wasn't my first special purpose group. It was young people's. I was 14 years old when I was brought to my first meeting, and 16 years old when I got sober. And so, of course, I wasn't planning on staying around. People were saying things, they were trying to be helpful, but they didn't share my experience. You're so lucky to be sober at your age. And I'm thinking, you're so lucky to only have maybe 10 New Year's Eves left in you. You know, like, how am I going to stay sober, you know, for the rest of my life, right? You know, you say to yourself all of this, oh really, right? You know, I've been to the emergency department, dragged in by an ambulance 3 times in the last 6 months. How lucky am I? Let's go through this, right? You know, my friends don't call me anymore. No one says, Joe, we miss you. Why don't you come over and steal Mom's car and pee on the couch like last time? You know, come on, we miss you. And so connection was hugely important to me, and I think we hear it in everybody's story. Hope, again, that contagious thing. What did you first hear that made you feel hope? That when you said, I can't do this, maybe it works, maybe AA works, okay, I see it works for you, that's great. I'm different. It's not going to work for me. To, oh no, maybe. Okay, I'll come back to the meeting. When is it? Next Tuesday? I'll be here. Right? You know, when did that happen for you? It happens for all of us, right? And think of the last new person who joined your home group, online or in person. When did you see that happen? Because we recognize this, right? Like I don't know if addiction is a disease or if it's an allergy or whatever it is, but it's a phenomena. I recognize it in me. I told you about the pecan pie, right? You know, I recognize it in you, right? I know what addiction is and I know what recovery is. I can't look anybody in the eye and say that person's had their last drink. None of us get to know that, right? You know, but I know addiction and I know recovery, and when we see that hope showing up in the lives of others, how can that not help but make me feel better? You know, about, you know, having to put on this why doesn't anybody else, you know, blah, 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 right? We were joking earlier that to get out of a Zoom commitment in our home group, you have to lose your phone number, you know, because, you know, you got to be dead or unreachable before someone else will take over for you. So the social contagion of hope and identity. I talked about the first time I said, my name's Joe and I'm an alcoholic, and I thought, what on earth am I saying and who am I trying to impress? Like, what was your experience with it? Or how do you identify? I love the fact that that's not a requirement for membership, right? My name's Joe, period. Troy. Part of me is alcoholic. I think that's great. It's not his entire identity, right? Part of him is a dad. Part of him is an employee, right? You know, part of him is American. Like all these different sources of maybe Cosby Stills a MASH fan, right? There's all of these identity factors, right? But only part of him is an alcoholic. You know, when they started People First, you know, my name's Joe and I'm someone with addiction. Like, that hasn't ended the stigma, but let's keep trying. You know, I think that was a good idea. And the great thing is, we can change that, right? We can stop identifying with what the problem is and start identifying with the solution, right? You know, my name's Joe, and I'm a happy customer of Beyond Belief Agnostics and Free Thinkers AA group, right? You know, that's all I need to say, if anything at all. And meaning, what gives you meaning? What would you rather be doing than going to a 12-step meeting? Because I think that's really essential, no matter how long you are in sobriety. 90 meetings, 90 days, great idea. Some of us were sober at a time where there weren't 90 meetings in the whole town. And, you know, so that came from treatment talk. And it's a good idea. In Zoom, we could do 90 meetings in 9 days. You know, wow. You know, that was powerful, right? What was my point? I often lose my point. That's why I love these slides. Okay, so everyone needs something they'd rather do than go to their meeting, right? Like, I'm in my mid-60s, I still play softball. It hurts, you know, I never get over an injury from the first game to the end of the season, right? But, you know, I love doing it. I don't know why. It's kind of meaningless. Sometimes I even take it too seriously. Sometimes I care about the outcome. Very silly. No scouts out there checking me out, you know, just have some fun, Joe, but having fun is something that is actually an acquired knowledge for me, a little cerebral. So what do you love, right? What matters to you? Again, we went through that counselor talking to someone unsure, you know, 1 foot in, 1 foot out. What matters to you? None of it was drugs or alcohol, right? And what does the world need, right? There is a lot we do in recovery that we can take out into the world and make it a little better place. We're going to hear a talk Sunday by Trish Travers, who is the head of women's studies at University of Florida. She's done a lot of history of women in AA, and she's talking about recovery in a polarized world, right? What does that look like with the fundamentalist groups and the free thinkers groups, and you know, everyone pointing the finger at, what, do you hear what they're doing at their group? No, because I'm not at their group. I'm at our group, right? Who cares what they're reading? Come on, let's get on with the meeting, right? But we do live in this sort of polarized world, and I understand the science of it. I get a dopamine rush every time I get a little hit of, you know, righteous indignation. Look at those stupid people doing stupid things. I feel better about myself already, and I haven't even started doing what I was supposed to do. So I get that. And empowerment. And I talked already about, you know, these things come in a number of different ways. To be passive is to let others decide for you. To be aggressive is to decide for others. To be assertive is to decide for yourself and to trust that there is enough, that you are enough. If that's what empowerment is, that's what I want. I mean, that sounds like bulletproof recovery to me, if I can maintain that sort of thought pattern. And do you have post-traumatic gains? Have you ever heard someone say, I'm grateful to be someone with addiction, or someone who with alcohol or substance use disorder, or however they identify? You know, the first time you hear that, you go, what kind of cult are you in, right? Like, I'm not going to your home group, right? But what do they mean by that? They mean that they're better off today than they were when they went to the bottle or their drug of choice to solve the existential angst that they were suffering from. That they wouldn't give up all of the suffering, and they wouldn't give up the hard work of recovery because of what they have today. They're grateful for the whole process. That's empowering. So even in our earliest AA literature, we see signs of this CHIME stuff. So he gave me information about the subject of alcoholism, which was undoubtedly helpful. Of far more importance was the fact that he, as the first living human with whom I had ever talked, who knew what he was talking about in regards to alcoholism from actual experience. In other words, he talked my language. He knew all the answers, and certainly not because he had picked them up from his reading. Maybe he was talking about reading his own book. That was Dr. Bob describing connection, right? Like the turning point for him, and like Dr. Bob already knew more about addiction than Bill Wilson did, right? You know, like he was a doctor, but he needed someone who could speak his language. He needed connection. Hope, where does that show up? Well, if you persist, remarkable things will happen, working with others. He, Ebby Thatcher, had come to pass his experience along for me. If I cared to have it, I was shocked but interested. Certainly, I was interested. I had to be, for I was hopeless. His human will had failed him. Doctors had pronounced him incurable. Society was about to lock him up. Like myself, he admitted complete defeat. Then he had in effect been raised from the dead, suddenly taken from the scrap heap to a level of life better than he'd known before. That's Bill talking about hope. And if you go through the whole, I know it's dinner time, so I'm gonna leave the last slide on where you can email me and I'll give you the whole slide deck, right? But what I'm saying is the people who discovered this CHIME idea didn't invent it. They observed it. They observed it in us. And they observed it in something that's been going on even longer than, if you look at the Bill White's work on the history of recovery and the history of addiction in America, you know, this sort of communal approach, the Red Road, right, in the indigenous community. They were finding ways that other people who had given up the bottle could help people with addiction in ways that the doctors and the white men certainly could not. But you'll find this everywhere. Yes, there is a substitute, and it's vastly more than that. It's the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. There you will find relief from care, boredom, and worry. Your imagination will be fired. Life will mean something at last, ... You've heard it before because it's in a vision for you. Meaning, boom, carry the message to other alcoholics. You can help when no one else can. You know, it wasn't that, I honestly don't believe people need to be told. They need to feel heard. And I was, you know, like again, a lot of us who've been around a long time used to go to people's homes, deal with them drunk and hostile, and help them out, take them to a meeting if they go, come back the next day if they wouldn't, right? That's how we introduce people to AA. And we poured them a half a cup of coffee because we could see they had the shakes. And most people I know who got sober in the last 20 years have never been on a 12-step call. No one ever called to send them out to do that. And maybe that's just a better way of doing things. But I was in a situation where I was visiting someone who was concerned about a fallen angel, someone who was on relapse. And I said, well, let's go. Oh, well, what are we going to say? I don't know. Let's go. Well, how are we going to get there? Well, we're going to try. What if they're not? Well, we'll work that out when we get there. Our job isn't to have the right thing to say. Our job isn't to get them sober. Our job is to show up and be present. And Bill Shaberg, in his new book, 30 Things, Practical Advice for Living Well. We all know him from writing the big book, The Creation of AA, this great scholarly work that we've been reading, many of us since 2019 when it came out, that really, he has an amazing way that some people have of completely deconstructing myths and still having positive regard for the people who created them because of the underlying, the more important result than whether it was factually accurate, whether only God can redeem, you know, like those are the details that were wrong, but what they created has still worked, and people who study us in this way still have positive regard. I think that's great. I come from the school of fault finding like there's a reward for it and feeling good about it. So I try to, you know, okay, I get this. I could do more of that. What was my point? Okay, right. So the 12-step call. So he has a chapter. You can pretend to care, but you can't pretend to be there. We have to show up for each other. Like, the right book isn't going to get everybody sober. The right meeting isn't going to get everybody sober. But the right one-on-one, eyeball to eyeball, one person who understands talking to another person who, you know, can't figure it out, that is fucking meaningful to me. And it never gets old. It never gets old, and like I said, there are things I'd rather do than be here. I was ready to go to the 2015 Atlanta AA World Convention, and I think I'm going to Vancouver because I registered, but it was 2015 in Atlanta, and I got a call from my adult daughter. Hey, I'm available this week. Do you want to come to the White Horse and we can go camping and do some glacier hiking? Yep. Cancel those AA plans. My son and I flew out to White Horse and we spent Canada Day, which is July 1st, in White Horse. We were in Juneau, Alaska for 4th of July. And I have pictures and memories and experiences that really matter to me. And so that kind of meaning comes to us and is really important. And other people have found that in us, and they're reporting it out. Empowerment, same thing. Into action, you can read all about it. Special purposes groups. People, instead of fighting the darkness, can I shine the light? And I just want to shine the light on some things we're getting right. And some of our pamphlets, which are woman to woman, agnostic to agnostic, atheist to atheist, person who identifies as gay to person who identifies as gay, person who identifies as neurodivergent to someone who's neurodivergent. We're doing a good job not only of creating these pamphlets, but updating them as we go along. I think that's great. They don't ask me before they vote on things at the General Service Conference, or, when I'm in charge, things will be different here. I want to close with this, and this is Dr. Polly Murray, who died in 1940. So this is way before Rosa Parks. She was arrested in Virginia for refusing to move to the back of the bus. And she was introducing nonviolent protest to the civil rights movement 10 years before Martin Luther King. And her quote is, "When my brothers attempt to draw a circle to exclude me, I will draw a larger circle that includes them." Isn't that awesome? What more needs to be said? I'll leave that up if you want to grab that. If you want to get the slide deck, just take a picture of it. Let's go eat. Thanks for your time. And we can talk about this all weekend long. I would love to argue with me, tell me your stories. It'll be just great. I'm still learning about this.
Very good presentation, Joe. Very good. I associate hands. I can't put this.
Good man.
Good man.
Thanks, Joe.
You bet. Pleasure.
Just wanted to add
Oh,
that.
God. So much better to see my wife in there. Do some video?